There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room late at night, when the world outside has gone still and the only thing left awake, it seems, is the mind. If you are listening to this now, you have probably found your way into that quiet on purpose. You have turned down the lights, perhaps pulled a blanket a little higher, and decided that tonight you will let history carry you towards sleep rather than keep you from it. That is exactly what we are going to do. Tonight we are going to travel back slowly and without hurry to a place so old that it has been called, by historians for more than a century, the cradle of civilization. We are going to walk along the banks of two rivers that no longer flow quite where they once did, through cities whose walls have long since dissolved into the dust of southern Iraq, and into the quiet, patient story of the people who lived, worked, worshipped, and dreamed in the land between the rivers. This is the story of Mesopotamia. There is no need to remember every name you hear tonight. There is no test waiting for you in the morning, no quiz on dates or kings or the order in which empires rose and fell. You are welcome to let the details slip past you the way a river slips past a stone, wearing it smooth without either of them noticing the moment of change. What matters is only that you are here, warm and safe, while somewhere in the deep past a farmer is walking out to check on his barley, a scribe is pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, and a priest is climbing the long ramp of a temple tower to greet the first light of a morning that ended more than 4,000 years ago. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you right now. Let your shoulders drop an inch or two, however slightly, away from your ears. Let your jaw loosen. There is nothing you need to do tonight except listen, and eventually, whenever your body is ready, to stop listening and drift into sleep, which is, after all, the oldest and most human of all activities, older even than the rivers we are about to follow. Mesopotamia is not the name any of the people we are about to meet would have used for their own home. It is a word that comes from ancient Greek, meaning simply the land between the rivers, and it was applied much later, by outsiders looking back at a region whose own inhabitants would have used other names entirely, names tied to smaller cities and older loyalties. But it has become the name we use today for the long, flat stretch of land that follows the courses of the Tigris and the Euphrates, from the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey down through modern Iraq to the marshes where the rivers finally meet the waters of the Persian Gulf. It is a landscape that most people, if they pictured it at all, might imagine as empty desert, and in truth much of it is dry, sun-bleached, and quiet today. But 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, this same stretch of land was something else entirely. It was, quite plausibly, the most extraordinary place on the surface of the earth, the place where humans first gathered in numbers large enough and organized in ways complex enough to be called cities, and where the very idea of a city, with its walls and its temples and its crowded streets and its written laws, was invented for what may have been the first time anywhere. Tonight, we will move slowly through this long story, chapter by chapter, the way the rivers themselves move. Without hurry, without straight lines, occasionally doubling back on themselves, occasionally overflowing their banks and settling somewhere new. We will begin with the land itself, the actual physical shape of the ground and the water that made everything else possible. From there we will watch as the first villages grow into the first true cities, as farmers become priests and merchants and scribes, as the marks pressed into wet clay slowly become the world's first system of writing. We will sit for a while with the old gods of Sumer, and with the kings who claimed to rule in their name. We will follow the strange, moving story of Gilgamesh, a king who may once have been a real man and who became, over centuries of retelling, a legend about mortality itself. We will watch an ambitious cupbearer named Sargon build the world's first great multi-city empire, and watch that empire fall, as all empires eventually do. We will walk into Babylon under Hammurabi, who carved his laws into stone so that they might outlast him, and we will walk into Babylon again centuries later, under Nebuchadnezzar, when the city had become perhaps the most magnificent in the entire ancient world. We will pass through the iron fist of Assyria, and through the long, dusty stretches of time in between, when history was quieter, and villages simply lived their lives, planting and harvesting and raising children under skies that have not changed even if everything beneath them has. None of this requires effort from you. Historians have spent lifetimes piecing together this story from broken pottery, from tablets no bigger than the palm of a hand, from the outlines of buildings visible only from the air. Tonight, all of that patient work has already been done for you, gathered together into a single slow unfolding voice meant only to keep you gentle company as your own mind slows down and prepares for rest. So let us begin, the way any long journey along a river begins, at the water's edge, with the land itself. To understand Mesopotamia, it helps to first understand its geography, because in this particular corner of the ancient world, geography was not simply a backdrop to history. It was very nearly the author of it. The two rivers that give the region its name, the Tigris and the Euphrates, rise not far from one another in the highlands of eastern Anatolia, in the mountains of what is today Turkey, fed by winter snow that melts each spring and sends water rushing southward and eastward across a long, gradually flattening plain. The Euphrates is the longer and gentler of the two, winding and wide, looping curves through what is now Syria and then Iraq, while the Tigris runs a more direct and faster course, closer to the mountains of Iran, prone to sudden and sometimes violent floods when the snowmelt arrives all at once. For most of their length, the two rivers run roughly parallel to one another, sometimes as much as 100 miles apart, sometimes drawing close enough that a traveler could walk from one to the other in a single day. Eventually, far to the south, near the modern city of Basra, they join together and flow as a single wide waterway into the Persian Gulf, though in ancient times the coastline itself sat somewhat further inland than it does today, since thousands of years of silt carried down by the rivers have slowly built new land out into what was once open water. It is worth pausing here in this early part of our story, simply to picture the plain itself, because the shape of that plain explains almost everything that follows. Between the two rivers, and for some distance to either side of them, the land is remarkably flat, built up over tens of thousands of years from silt deposited by floodwaters. This flatness meant that irrigation, once people learn how to manage it, could spread water across enormous stretches of farmland with relatively modest effort, since water does not need to be pushed uphill on a landscape with almost no hills at all. But that same flatness also meant that the rivers themselves were unpredictable, prone to shifting their courses gradually over decades or suddenly during a single catastrophic flood, abandoning old channels and carving new ones, leaving cities that had once stood proudly on a riverbank stranded, sometimes miles from the nearest reliable water source. This is one of the quiet, recurring themes of Mesopotamian history. The relationship between people and water was never a settled, comfortable one. It was a relationship that required constant tending, constant negotiation, constant labor, and the people who lived along these rivers developed, very early in their history, an entire way of life organized around exactly that labor. Rainfall in the southern part of Mesopotamia, the region the ancient inhabitants called Sumer, is extremely low, low enough that farming without irrigation would have been essentially impossible for most crops in most years. And yet this same region, once irrigation was mastered, became astonishingly fertile, producing yields of barley that, according to some ancient records that survive on clay tablets, could be extraordinarily high by the standards of any pre-modern society. This combination, harsh natural conditions paired with immense potential fertility once those conditions were mastered through human effort, created a kind of pressure that historians believe helped drive the development of complex society in this particular region earlier than in almost anywhere else on Earth. Digging and maintaining irrigation canals is not something a single family can easily do alone. It requires cooperation among many households, coordination of labor, decisions about how water should be shared and canals should be maintained, records kept of contributions and obligations. Some of the very earliest writing we have from Mesopotamia is not poetry or religious text at all, but administrative record-keeping, lists of grain, tallies of labor, receipts for goods delivered and debts owed. The mundane necessity of managing water and food surplus may have been one of the deep, quiet roots from which the flowering of Sumerian civilization eventually grew. The northern part of Mesopotamia, sometimes called Assyria in later periods after the people who came to dominate it, has a somewhat different character. It receives more rainfall than the south, enough in many areas to support agriculture without extensive irrigation, and its landscape includes more rolling hills and eventually, further north and east, real mountains. This northern region tended, across much of Mesopotamian history, to be somewhat less densely urbanized than the south in the earliest periods, though it would eventually become the heartland of one of the most powerful and, frankly, one of the most feared empires of the ancient world, which we will meet later in tonight's story. For now, it is enough to hold in your mind this simple geographic division: a southern floodplain, flat, hot, dry except where irrigated, and extraordinarily fertile once tamed, where the very first cities would rise, and a northern zone of gentler rainfall and rougher terrain, which would develop somewhat later but would eventually come to rival, and for a time surpass, the south in political power. The climate of the region then, as now, was one of extremes. Summers in southern Mesopotamia are ferociously hot, with temperatures regularly climbing well past what most modern people would consider bearable, while winters, though far milder than in more northern latitudes, can still bring genuinely cold nights and occasional rain. The ancient inhabitants built their homes accordingly, using thick walls of sun-dried mud brick, since stone was scarce across most of the alluvial plain and timber even scarcer, with few windows facing the harsh southern and western sun, and often with rooms arranged around a central courtyard that could catch whatever breeze the day offered. Because good building stone had to be imported from distant mountains, and good timber likewise had to travel long distances down the rivers or across overland trade routes, the ordinary Mesopotamian house, and even many of the grandest palaces and temples, were built primarily from a material that was available everywhere along the riverbanks in essentially unlimited supply: mud. Mixed with straw, shaped in wooden molds, and left to dry in the sun, mud brick became the single most defining building material of this entire civilization, and it is worth noting, if only quietly, that this very fact is part of why so much of ancient Mesopotamia has vanished so completely from the surface of the modern landscape. Stone monuments endure. Mud brick, over centuries of rain and wind and the slow creep of dust, tends eventually to melt back into the earth from which it came, leaving only low mounds, called tells, scattered across the Iraqi countryside, each one a buried city waiting, in its own patient way, to be uncovered by an archaeologist's careful trowel. It was into this landscape, then hot and dry and unpredictable, but also astonishingly capable of feeding a large population once its waters were properly managed, that the first true cities of human history would eventually rise. And it is to the slow, gradual story of that rise that we will turn next, moving from scattered farming villages towards something the world had, as far as we can tell, never quite seen before. Long before anyone thought to call this land Sumer, or Mesopotamia, or anything at all, small communities of farmers had already begun to settle along the edges of the rivers and their tributaries, drawn by soil that, once watered, could produce far more food than the same effort would yield in drier country further from any river. Archaeologists who have studied this region describe a slow, gradual process stretching across many centuries, in which small villages of a few dozen or a few hundred people, growing barley and wheat, herding sheep and goats, slowly grew larger, absorbed nearby settlements, or gave rise to new ones nearby, until by roughly the 4th millennium before the Common Era, something new had begun to appear on this landscape. Settlements large enough, and organized in ways complex enough that historians are comfortable calling them, for the first time in human history, cities. This period, which scholars often call the Uruk period after the city that came to dominate it, deserves to be sat with for a moment, because it represents one of the genuine turning points in the entire human story. Before this time, as far as the archaeological evidence tells us, human beings everywhere on Earth lived in relatively small, relatively egalitarian communities, whether they were farmers or hunter-gatherers. There were no true cities anywhere. There was no writing anywhere. There were no kings in the sense we would recognize the word, no standing armies, no formal temples with dedicated full-time priests, no long-distance trade networks moving standardized goods across hundreds of miles. And then, in the marshy, sun-baked lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, something shifted. Populations concentrated. Some individuals and families began to accumulate more wealth, more land, more influence than their neighbors. Temples grew from small shrines into large, imposing structures requiring organized labor to build and maintain. And a settlement called Uruk grew, over the course of a few centuries, into what may well have been the largest city the world had ever seen up to that point, home, at its height, to perhaps 50 or 60,000 people, an almost unimaginable concentration of humanity by the standards of anywhere else on Earth at that time. We do not know, and likely never will know with certainty, exactly why this transformation happened here first, rather than in Egypt, or the Indus Valley, or the river valleys of China, all of which would develop their own complex civilizations in the centuries and millennia that followed. Historians have proposed many explanations, some emphasizing the particular demands of irrigation agriculture in this specific flood-prone environment, others pointing to the region's position at a crossroads of trade routes connecting the mountains, the desert, and the sea, still others noting simply that once one region achieves this kind of breakthrough, its methods and innovations tend to spread outward to its neighbors, so that Mesopotamia's head start, whatever its original cause, was reinforced and amplified over time. What we can say with more confidence is what this transformation actually looked like on the ground, because archaeologists have spent well over a century carefully excavating sites across southern Iraq, piecing together a picture of daily life in these first cities that is, in its own quiet way, extraordinarily vivid. Picture, if you will, the city of Uruk as it might have appeared to a traveler arriving from a smaller village further up the Euphrates, sometime around 5,000 years ago. The traveler would have seen first, from a considerable distance across the flat plain, a great mud brick wall, built to enclose and protect the city, a wall that later legend would attribute to the hero king Gilgamesh himself, though its true builders are lost to us. Approaching closer, the traveler would have passed through fields of barley and date palm groves, irrigated by canals branching off the main river channel, worked by farmers whose labor fed the entire urban population beyond. Within the walls, the traveler would have found narrow, winding streets, packed with mud brick houses built close together to conserve both space and the cooling shade each wall provided its neighbor, workshops where potters shaped clay on turning wheels, an invention that itself may have originated in exactly this period and place, and markets where farmers, herders, fishermen, and craftspeople exchanged their goods. And rising above all of this, visible from far outside the city walls, the traveler would have seen the temples. Great platforms of mud brick, rebuilt and enlarged generation after generation, each new temple constructed directly atop the ruins of the last, dedicated to the city's patron deities, whose favor, the Sumerians believed, was the true source of the city's prosperity. The temple, in fact, deserves special attention in this early period, because it appears to have functioned as something closer to the economic and administrative heart of the city than simply a place of worship in the narrower modern sense. Sumerian temples of this era owned enormous tracts of agricultural land, employed large numbers of workers, including weavers, brewers, bakers, and farm laborers, and functioned as a kind of central storehouse and redistribution point, collecting surplus grain and other goods and reallocating them according to need, or according to religious obligation, or according to the judgment of the temple's administrators, who were among the most powerful figures in the entire city. It was precisely this administrative complexity, the sheer difficulty of tracking who had contributed what to the temple, who was owed what in return, how much grain sat in which storehouse, that appears to have driven one of the single most consequential inventions in the entire history of our species, an invention we will explore in some detail in the next chapter of tonight's story, writing itself. Before we move there, though, it is worth lingering a little longer over what daily life might actually have felt like in one of these early cities, since it is easy, when discussing kings and temples and grand historical transformations, to lose sight of the ordinary people whose lives made up the actual texture of this civilization. A typical family in early Uruk likely lived in a small mud brick house of perhaps 2 or 3 rooms, arranged, when space allowed, around a small open courtyard that let in light and air while keeping the harsh sun mostly at bay. Meals centered on barley, the staple grain of the entire region, prepared as bread or as a thick porridge, supplemented with dates from the palm trees that lined the canals, with fish caught in the rivers and marshes, with the milk, cheese, and occasional meat provided by sheep and goats, and for those wealthy enough, with beer, which was brewed in enormous quantities throughout Mesopotamian history and consumed by essentially everyone, from field laborers to kings, often through long reed straws dipped into a communal vessel, since the beer of this era was thick with unfiltered grain solids. Clothing was generally woven from wool, since flax and cotton were less commonly available in this region during the earliest periods, and archaeologists have found evidence of surprisingly sophisticated textile production, with specialized workers, often women, producing woven goods that were themselves traded across considerable distances. Children in these early cities would have grown up surrounded by the sounds and smells of a genuinely urban environment, something almost no human being anywhere on Earth had experienced before this particular moment in history. The calls of merchants in the market, the lowing of cattle being driven to slaughter or to pasture, the rhythmic sound of grain being ground, the murmur of religious processions moving toward the temple on festival days. It was, in its own way, a world being invented in real time, its inhabitants making up the rules of urban life as they went, since there was no older civilization anywhere for them to learn from or imitate. Everything about how a city should function, how strangers who were not kin should nonetheless live peacefully side by side, how disputes should be settled, how food should be stored and distributed, how labor should be organized for large public projects like city walls and canals, all of this had to be worked out, slowly, through trial and adjustment, by the people of Sumer themselves. And it is precisely this process of working things out, of managing complexity that had outgrown human memory alone, that leads us directly into the story of writing, which is where we will turn next. If there is a single invention that most clearly marks the transition from prehistory into history, in the most literal sense of that word, it is writing, and it is one of the quieter but more remarkable facts of the ancient world that writing, as far as the archaeological record allows us to say with confidence, was invented independently in only a small handful of places across the entire span of human existence, and that Mesopotamia was very likely the first of them. The story of how writing emerged here is not a story of sudden inspiration, of a single brilliant individual sitting down one day and deciding to invent an alphabet. It is instead a slow, gradual, almost accidental story, born out of the everyday practical problem we touched on at the end of the last chapter. The difficulty of keeping track of goods, labor, and obligations in a society that had grown too large and too complex for memory alone to manage. The earliest precursors to writing in Mesopotamia were not symbols at all, in the sense we would normally mean that word, but small clay tokens, some shaped like cones, others like spheres, discs, or cylinders, each shape apparently representing a particular quantity of a particular good, a certain measure of grain, perhaps, or a single sheep or a jar of oil. These tokens, some dating back many centuries before the invention of true writing, were used to track transactions and obligations, sealed sometimes inside hollow clay balls called bulli, which acted as a kind of tamper-proof record, since the tokens inside could not be altered without breaking open the ball itself and leaving obvious evidence of the tampering. Over time, someone apparently realized that instead of sealing tokens inside a clay ball, one could simply press the tokens into the outside of a flat clay tablet before it dried, leaving an impression that recorded the same information without needing to enclose anything at all. And from there, it was a relatively short step, though one that likely took generations to fully develop, to realize that the impressions themselves, rather than the physical tokens that made them, were what actually mattered, and that a stylus, a simple pointed or wedge-shaped tool, could be used to draw or press these same symbols directly into wet clay far more efficiently than manipulating physical tokens ever could. By around 5,100 years ago, give or take a century or two depending on which archaeological finds one weighs most heavily, the scribes of Uruk and other southern Mesopotamian cities were using a system of pictographic signs, small pictures representing objects, pressed and drawn into flat clay tablets with a reed stylus, to record exactly the kind of administrative information we described earlier. Quantities of grain, numbers of animals, allocations of labor, receipts of goods delivered to or from the temple. These earliest written tablets are, frankly, not very exciting to read, even in translation, consisting largely of numbers followed by pictographic symbols for commodities. But their significance lies not in their content but in the sheer fact of their existence. For the first time in the history of our species, information could be recorded in a form that did not depend on any human being remembering it, information that could, in principle, outlast the death of everyone who had witnessed the original transaction, information that could be checked, verified, and referred back to at any later date. Over the following centuries, this system evolved and grew steadily more sophisticated. The pictographic signs, which had begun as fairly literal drawings of the objects they represented, gradually became more abstract and stylized, in part simply through the process of many generations of scribes copying and recopying the same signs, each copy drifting slightly further from a literal picture, and in part because the reed stylus, when pressed into clay at an angle rather than dragged across it, naturally produces wedge-shaped marks rather than smooth curved lines, which encouraged scribes to reshape their signs into combinations of straight wedge strokes that could be pressed quickly and cleanly. This wedge-shaped writing system is the reason we today call the script cuneiform, from a Latin word meaning wedge-shaped, and it would go on to become the dominant writing system across the entire Near East for roughly 3,000 years, used not only for the Sumerian language but eventually adapted to write Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and several other languages entirely unrelated to Sumerian. Alongside this evolution in the physical shape of the signs, an even more consequential change was taking place in how the signs functioned. In the earliest period, most signs were purely pictographic or ideographic, representing a whole word or concept directly. Much like a modern road sign showing a picture of a fuel pump means simply gas station without spelling out any of the individual sounds in those words. But scribes gradually discovered that some signs could also be used for their sound value alone, regardless of their original pictographic meaning, allowing them to spell out words, particularly names and abstract grammatical elements, that had no obvious picture to represent them. This development from pure pictography toward a mixed system incorporating phonetic, sound-based elements was an enormous conceptual leap, one that made it possible, for the first time, to write down more or less anything that could be spoken, not merely lists of countable goods but full sentences, stories, prayers, laws, letters, and eventually, as we will see later in tonight's story, some of the oldest works of literature that survive anywhere in the world. It is worth taking a moment here to imagine the actual physical experience of writing in ancient Mesopotamia, since it was, quite literally, a hands-on process in a way that modern writing, whether by pen or by keyboard, no longer quite is. A scribe would prepare a small, flat tablet of fine clay, usually sized to fit comfortably in one hand, keeping it slightly moist and workable. Using a stylus cut from a reed, a plant that grew abundantly along the riverbanks and marshes of southern Mesopotamia, the scribe would press the tip into the clay at carefully controlled angles, producing the combinations of wedge-shaped strokes that made up each individual cuneiform sign. Working quickly, since the clay would begin to dry and stiffen within an hour or two under the hot Mesopotamian sun, a skilled scribe could produce dozens or even hundreds of signs, filling one side of the tablet and then the other, sometimes continuing onto additional tablets for longer texts. Once the writing was complete, tablets that needed to be preserved permanently, such as important legal documents or literary works destined for a temple library, could be fired in a kiln, hardening the clay into something remarkably durable enough, in fact, that many tens of thousands of these tablets have survived, buried in the ruins of ancient cities for 4,000 or 5,000 years, waiting patiently in the earth until archaeologists finally lifted them back into the light. Learning to read and write cuneiform was, by all accounts, a genuinely demanding education, one that took years of dedicated study and was available only to a relatively small portion of Mesopotamian society. Scribal schools, which the Sumerians called a dubba, meaning literally tablet house, trained young students, most of them boys from families wealthy enough to spare a child from ordinary labor, in the many hundreds of individual cuneiform signs, in the grammar and vocabulary of Sumerian and, later, Akkadian, and in the specialized knowledge a professional scribe would need, including mathematics, since scribes were often responsible for surveying land, calculating harvest yields, and managing complex administrative accounts. We know a surprising amount about these schools because the students themselves, in the ordinary course of their training, produced practice tablets that have survived, including some charmingly human documents in which a student appears to complain, in his own halting cuneiform, about being beaten by his teacher for poor handwriting, or about the tedium of endless repetitive exercises, sentiments that will likely feel entirely familiar to anyone who has ever sat through a difficult school assignment, separated from that ancient student by 5,000 years and yet connected to him by the simple, ordinary experience of finding one's schoolwork tiresome. The scribes who successfully completed this long training became some of the most valued and respected professionals in Mesopotamian society, employed by temples, by palaces, by wealthy merchants, and eventually by the great empires that would rise and fall across this landscape over the following millennia. It was these scribes, working patiently across countless generations, who preserve for us essentially everything we know today about ancient Mesopotamian religion, law, literature, science, and daily administration, and it is thanks to their careful, disciplined labor pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay day after day that we are able tonight, so many thousands of years later, to reconstruct even a fraction of the world they once inhabited. In our next chapter, we will turn to the gods those scribes wrote about, and to the great temples where much of Sumerian religious life unfolded. The religion of ancient Sumer, and of the broader Mesopotamian civilization that grew from it, was not a religion of comfortable certainties or promises of eternal reward. It was, instead, a religion shaped by the same landscape we described at the very beginning of tonight's journey, a landscape of rivers that could bring life-giving water one season and devastating floods the next, of harvests that could be abundant in a good year and catastrophically thin in a bad one, of a climate that offered no guarantees. The Sumerians looked at this unpredictable world and concluded, reasonably enough given what they observed, that it was governed by a great many powerful beings, gods and goddesses, each responsible for some aspect of the natural or human world, each possessing their own personality, their own preferences, their own capacity for both generosity and anger, very much like powerful human rulers, only vastly more capable and long-lived. At the head of this divine family stood a number of especially important deities. And, sometimes written anew, was the god of the sky itself, a somewhat distant and abstract figure who represented supreme authority even if he was not always the most actively worshipped god in daily practice. Enlil, whose name means something like Lord of the Storm or Lord of the Open Air, was in many respects the effective head of the Sumerian pantheon for much of early history, a god of wind, storm, and the authority to grant or withdraw kingship itself among human rulers. Enki, god of the freshwater that lay beneath the earth and of wisdom and craftsmanship, was often portrayed as a clever and even mischievous figure, closely associated with the city of Eridu, which Sumerian tradition remembered as the very first city to receive the gift of kingship from the heavens. And Inanna, later known by her Akkadian name Ishtar, was among the most vividly drawn deities in the entire pantheon, a goddess of love, sexuality, and war simultaneously, unpredictable and passionate, the subject of some of the most beautiful poetry that survives from ancient Mesopotamia. Beyond these major figures, the Sumerian pantheon included gods for the sun, the moon, for particular cities, for particular crafts and occupations, for the underworld, and for countless smaller aspects of daily and natural life, so that a Sumerian farmer might pray to one deity for a good harvest, another for protection during childbirth, and another still for safety on a journey. Each major city in Sumer had its own patron deity, whose temple stood at the physical and spiritual center of the city, and whose favor was believed to be directly connected to that city's prosperity or misfortune. Uruk was closely associated with An and with Inanna. Nippur, which functioned as something like the religious capital of Sumer even when it was not the most politically powerful city, was the home of Enlil's great temple. Eridu belonged to Enki. Each city, in other words, understood itself not simply as a human settlement but as a household belonging to its divine patron, with the human king serving, in a sense, as the god's steward or representative on earth, managing the city's affairs on the deity's behalf. The temples themselves, which we touched on briefly in an earlier chapter, grew over the centuries into some of the most imposing structures the ancient world had yet produced. The characteristic Mesopotamian temple form, the ziggurat, was a stepped, tower-like structure built of mud brick, rising in successive tiers, each smaller than the one below, often crowned with a small shrine at its summit dedicated to the city's patron deity. The most famous of all ziggurats, the Great Temple Tower of Babylon dedicated to the god Marduk, would later inspire the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, though that particular structure belongs to a somewhat later period of our story than the one we are presently exploring. In earlier Sumerian times, ziggurats such as the Great Ziggurat of Ur, built and rebuilt over many centuries, would have dominated the skyline of their cities, visible from a great distance across the flat surrounding plain, climbed by ramps and staircases that priests would ascend during religious ceremonies, drawing closer, symbolically at least, to the heavens with each rising tier. Religious life in Sumer was tended by a substantial professional priesthood, organized in a hierarchy that included high priests and priestesses, often drawn from royal or noble families, as well as a wide range of lower-ranking temple personnel responsible for the daily practical business of temple life. Musicians who performed hymns during ceremonies, cooks who prepared offerings of food and drink for the gods, which were believed to actually nourish the deities in some real if mysterious sense, craftspeople who maintained the temple's statues and furnishings, and administrators who managed the temple's considerable agricultural land, herds, and storerooms, since, as we discussed earlier, temples functioned as major economic institutions in their own right, not merely places of worship in a narrow sense. A high priestess, in particular, held enormous social and religious prestige in many Sumerian cities, sometimes serving as the earthly representative of a specific goddess and playing a central ceremonial role in rituals meant to secure the city's fertility, prosperity, and protection. One of the more distinctive features of Sumerian religious thought, at least as it comes down to us through surviving texts, was a certain unflinching quality in how it approached questions of mortality and the afterlife. Unlike some later religious traditions that would offer their followers vivid hope of paradise or reward after death, the Sumerian vision of the afterlife, as expressed in surviving myths and laments, was generally rather bleak. The dead were believed to descend into a shadowy underworld, a dusty, joyless realm ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, where the spirits of the departed existed in a kind of dim, diminished shadow of their former lives, eating dust and clay, deprived of the sunlight and pleasures of the world above. This was, notably, the fate awaiting essentially everyone, regardless of how virtuously or wickedly they had lived, which suggests that Sumerian religion was oriented less around securing a good afterlife through moral behavior and more around securing a good and prosperous life in the present world, through proper reverence toward the gods, careful maintenance of their temples, and faithful performance of the rituals believed necessary to keep the cosmos functioning as it should. Daily religious practice for an ordinary Sumerian family likely involves small household shrines, offerings of food, drink, and incense made to personal or family deities believed to watch over the household's particular fortunes, and participation in the great public festivals that mark the agricultural calendar, planting festivals, harvest festivals, and especially the New Year festival, which in later Babylonian tradition became an elaborate multi-day ceremony involving processions, ritual, reenactments of the gods' primordial victories over the forces of chaos, and a ceremonial renewal of the king's authority to rule for the coming year. These festivals would have been among the most vivid communal experiences available to an ordinary resident of a Sumerian city, moments when the entire population might gather to watch processions of priests carrying divine statues through the streets, to hear hymns and music, and to share in ritual meals believed to connect the human and divine worlds, if only briefly, in a shared celebration of continuity and renewal. It is worth noting, as this chapter draws toward its close, that this religious worldview, with its powerful, human-like gods, its emphasis on temple worship and royal stewardship on the gods' behalf, and its rather sober view of what awaited everyone after death, would prove remarkably durable, persisting in its essential outlines for well over 2,000 years, adapted and reinterpreted by successive Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations, but never entirely abandoned until the much later arrival of new religious traditions to this ancient land. It formed the deep, quiet background against which all of the political drama we are about to explore, the rise of kings and empires, the wars and the law codes and the great building projects, actually took place, a background of temples and offerings and processions that would have felt, to the people living through these events, as permanent and unquestionable as the rivers themselves. From this world of gods and temples, we now turn to the human institution that grew up alongside it and, in many ways, drew its own authority from it, the institution of kingship. By the time we reach the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, a period historians often call the early dynastic period, Sumer had developed into a landscape not of a single unified nation but of a dozen or more independent city-states, each centered on a major urban center such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Umma, and Eridu, each with its own local ruler, its own patron deity, and its own fiercely maintained sense of independent identity, even while sharing a broadly common language, religion, and culture with its neighbors. This arrangement, a patchwork of competing city-states rather than a single centralized kingdom, would remain the basic political shape of southern Mesopotamia for many centuries, punctuated periodically by moments when one city or another managed to extend its influence over its neighbors, though rarely permanently and rarely without eventual pushback. Sumerian tradition, preserved in a fascinating document modern scholars call the Sumerian King List, presented this history somewhat differently than a strictly factual chronicle would, describing kingship as a kind of single, continuous institution that had descended from heaven itself at the very beginning of civilized history, residing first in one city and then, when that city fell from favor for reasons the text sometimes attributes to a great flood, passing to another city and then another in an orderly, sequential fashion. In reality, as archaeological evidence makes clear, many of these city-states existed and ruled simultaneously rather than in the single unbroken sequence the King List suggests, but the document remains invaluable to historians nonetheless, both for the genuine historical information it preserves about the names and approximate reign lengths of many early rulers, and for what it reveals about how the Sumerians themselves wished to understand and narrate their own deep past as an unbroken thread of divinely sanctioned authority stretching back to the very beginning of time. The Sumerian king, called Lugal, a word that literally means great man, or sometimes En, a somewhat more specifically religious title associated with the earliest form of city leadership, held a position that combined political, military, and religious authority in ways that a modern reader, accustomed to at least some separation between these spheres, might find unfamiliar. The king was responsible for leading the city's military forces in the frequent conflicts that arose between neighboring city-states, often disputes over water rights, border territories, or control of valuable trade routes. He was responsible for maintaining and expanding the great temples of the city's patron deities, an activity that served simultaneously as genuine religious devotion, as a display of royal wealth and piety intended to secure the gods' continued favor, and as an enormous public works project providing employment for large numbers of laborers. And he was responsible, at least in an ultimate sense, for the administration of justice, for the management of canals and irrigation infrastructure upon which the entire agricultural economy depended, and for the general prosperity and security of his city and its surrounding farmland. Some of the individual rulers of this early dynastic period have left behind inscriptions that offer us glimpses, however brief, of genuine historical personality across this enormous span of time. Eannatum, a king of the city of Lagash who ruled sometime in the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, left behind a remarkable carved stone monument known today as the Stele of the Vultures, commemorating his victory over the neighboring city of Umma in a long-running border dispute, and depicting, in carved relief, ranks of Lagash soldiers advancing in tight formation, spears leveled, shields overlapping, an image that represents one of the earliest known depictions of organized infantry warfare anywhere in the world. Uruk and Ur, a somewhat later ruler of the same city, is remembered, at least according to his own inscriptions, for a series of social reforms intended to curb the abuses of powerful officials and priests against ordinary citizens, reducing certain taxes and fees that had apparently grown burdensome, in what some historians have half-jokingly, half-seriously described as among the earliest recorded attempts at social justice reform in human history, though we should be appropriately cautious, as, with all royal inscriptions from any period of history, about taking a ruler's own account of his own virtuous reforms entirely at face value. The relationships between these various city-states were rarely simple or stable. Cities that were bound together by shared language, shared religious traditions, and extensive trade and marriage connections between their ruling families were nonetheless also frequently at war with one another, disputing borders, competing for control of strategic canals, and occasionally seeking outright dominance over their neighbors. The long conflict between Lagash and Umma, which produced the Stele of the Vultures mentioned a moment ago, dragged on intermittently across multiple generations of rulers on both sides, a reminder that even in this earliest recorded chapter of urban civilization, the pattern of prolonged recurring conflict between rival powers, so familiar from every later period of history, was already firmly established. Beneath the level of kings and their wars, though, ordinary Sumerian society was organized into a fairly elaborate social structure. At the top, alongside the royal family itself, sat the high priests and priestesses, wealthy landowners, and senior administrators, many of them connected by kinship or marriage to the ruling family. Below them came a broad middle layer of free citizens, farmers who owned or worked land, craftspeople of every kind, from potters and weavers to metalworkers and builders, merchants who traded goods both within Sumer and, increasingly, across long-distance networks reaching as far as the Indus Valley to the east and the eastern Mediterranean to the west, and scribes and other educated professionals employed by temples and palaces. And at the bottom of Sumerian society existed a population of slaves, typically prisoners captured in the frequent wars between city-states, or individuals who had fallen into slavery through debt they could not repay, though it is worth noting that slavery in ancient Mesopotamia, while certainly a real and often harsh institution, generally functioned somewhat differently than the racially based, hereditary chattel slavery familiar from more recent history, with Mesopotamian slaves sometimes able to own limited property, marry free persons, and, in some documented cases, eventually purchase their own freedom. Women's status in Sumerian society, while certainly subordinate to men's in most legal and political respects, was in some ways less restricted than it would become in certain later periods of Mesopotamian and broader ancient history. Women could, under certain circumstances, own and manage property, engage in trade and business on their own account, and, as we noted in the previous chapter, hold significant religious authority as priestesses. Enheduanna, a daughter of the later king Sargon of Akkad, whom we will meet properly in our next chapter, is remembered today as perhaps the earliest named author in all of human history, a high priestess of the moon god at Ur who composed hymns and poetry so admired that they continued to be copied and studied by scribal students for many centuries after her death, her name persisting in the historical record long after countless kings and generals had been entirely forgotten. As this chapter draws to its close, it is worth simply sitting for a moment with the picture we have now assembled, a landscape of proud, independent city-states, each centered on its temple and its patron god, each ruled by a king who was simultaneously military commander, religious steward, and chief administrator, each populated by farmers and craftspeople and merchants and priests and scribes and slaves, living out their lives across a very long stretch of centuries, planting and harvesting, worshipping and trading, occasionally going to war with the city just down the river, and all the while producing, almost as a side effect of managing this complex society, an ever-growing body of written literature. It is to one of the most remarkable pieces of that literature, the story of a king named Gilgamesh, that we will turn next. Among all the surviving works of ancient Mesopotamian literature, none has traveled further into the modern imagination than the story of Gilgamesh, a king who may once have ruled the city of Uruk sometime around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and whose name appears, in fact, in the very Sumerian king list we discussed in the previous chapter, listed among the early rulers of Uruk and credited, according to that ancient tradition, with an implausibly long reign of some 126 years. Whatever the historical truth behind this figure, and there likely was some real king at the root of the legend, the Gilgamesh who comes down to us through literature is a figure who grew, over many centuries of retelling, copying, and elaboration by generations of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian scribes, into something much larger than any single historical ruler. A meditation on power, friendship, grief, and the unavoidable fact of human mortality, expressed through one of the oldest extended narratives that survives anywhere in world literature. The version of the epic most widely read today is a later, Akkadian language compilation, often called the Standard Babylonian Version, assembled sometime in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era from older Sumerian source material, though even this standard version survives only in fragments, pieced together patiently by modern scholars from many different broken tablets recovered from several different ancient sites, most famously from the ruins of the great library of the Assyrian king, Ashur-banipal at Nineveh, which we will visit properly later in tonight's story. The epic opens by introducing Gilgamesh as a king of Uruk who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, extraordinarily strong and capable, but also, in the poem's early chapters, a genuinely troublesome ruler, restless and overbearing toward his own subjects, so much so that the people of Uruk cry out to the gods for relief from his excessive energy and demands. In response, the gods create a companion for Gilgamesh, a wild man named Enkidu, formed from clay and raised among the animals of the steppe, entirely innocent of civilized life until a temple priestess is sent to introduce him, gently and gradually, to human society, food, clothing, and companionship. Enkidu eventually travels to Uruk, where he and Gilgamesh, after an initial physical confrontation testing each other's strength, become the closest of friends, and it is this friendship, warm, genuine, and ultimately central to the entire emotional arc of the poem, that transforms Gilgamesh's restless energy into something more purposeful, if not necessarily wiser. Together, the two friends undertake a series of adventures, most famously a long journey to the distant cedar forest to confront and defeat its fearsome guardian, a monster named Humbaba, and later a confrontation with the divine bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Inanna after Gilgamesh spurns her romantic advances in a scene notable for its surprisingly candid and unflattering catalogue of the goddess's previous, poorly treated lovers. These early adventures, filled with genuine heroic action and something close to buddy comedy warmth between the two friends, give way, roughly at the poem's midpoint, to a much darker and more contemplative turn, one that many readers across the centuries have found genuinely moving. As punishment for the killing of Humbaba and the bull of heaven, the gods decree that Enkidu must die, and the poem lingers, with unusual tenderness for a work of this age, on Enkidu's illness, his fear, and his eventual death, and on Gilgamesh's overwhelming grief afterward, a grief so profound that the once restless, overbearing king refuses to accept his friend's death as final, wandering out into the wilderness in mourning clothes, his hair unkempt, consumed by a single obsessive question. If death can claim even Enkidu, who was so strong and so beloved, must it also eventually claim Gilgamesh himself, despite his partly divine nature? And if so, is there any way to escape it? This question drives the second half of the epic as Gilgamesh sets out on a long and difficult journey in search of Utnapishtim, a legendary figure who, according to the story, survived a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity and was granted, uniquely among mortals, the gift of immortality afterward. Gilgamesh's journey to find him takes him through mountain passes guarded by scorpion beings, across a dark tunnel beneath the mountains through which the sun itself travels each night, and eventually to the edge of the world, where he meets an alewife named Siduri, who offers him some of the most quietly striking advice found anywhere in ancient literature, advice that resonates, in fact, quite closely with the entire spirit of tonight's own gentle, unhurried journey through history. She tells him that the life he seeks he will never find, that when the gods created humankind, they kept immortality for themselves and gave mortality to human beings as their portion, and that Gilgamesh would do well, therefore, to fill his belly with good things, to bathe and dress in clean clothes, to cherish the children who hold his hand, and to make his wife happy in his embrace, since this, and not the fruitless pursuit of eternal life, is what has been granted to humankind to enjoy. Gilgamesh, restless as ever, does not immediately accept this counsel, and presses on until he finally reaches Utnapishtim himself, who recounts, in a section of the poem that closely parallels flood narratives found much later in other ancient Near Eastern traditions, the story of a great deluge sent by the gods, survived only by Utnapishtim and his family after they were warned in advance and instructed to build a great boat. Utnapishtim explains that his own immortality was a singular gift, granted under singular circumstances that will never be repeated for any other mortal, and offers Gilgamesh a final, almost taunting test. To stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, a challenge Gilgamesh, exhausted from his long journey, fails almost immediately, falling asleep within moments. If a hero as great as Gilgamesh cannot even conquer sleep, the poem gently implies, how could he possibly hope to conquer death itself? Even here, and this is worth noting quietly for anyone listening to this story as they drift toward their own rest tonight, sleep and mortality are woven together as reflections of one another, two thresholds that even the greatest of ancient heroes could not avoid crossing. The epic does not end in bitter despair, however. Utnapishtim, taking some pity on Gilgamesh's long and sincere effort, reveals the location of a plant, growing at the bottom of a subterranean sea, that has the power to restore youth to whoever eats it. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant, and sets off for home, intending to share this gift eventually with the elders of Uruk, only to have it stolen from him by a serpent while he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water during his journey. The plant lost forever the moment the serpent sheds its skin and disappears back into the earth. Gilgamesh weeps at this final loss, and yet the poem closes not with despair but with something closer to quiet acceptance and even pride, as Gilgamesh returns at last to Uruk and gazes upon the great walls of his own city, walls that, the poem tells us, will stand long after he himself is gone, a different kind of immortality than the one he originally sought, achieved not through escaping death but through the lasting works a person leaves behind for those who come after. It is worth reflecting, as we close this chapter, on just how remarkable it is that a story composed some 4,000 years ago should still speak so directly and so movingly to concerns that remain entirely recognizable today. The fear of losing someone we love, the wish that we ourselves might somehow escape the fact of our own mortality, and the quieter, harder-won wisdom that comes eventually to most people who live long enough to reflect honestly on these questions. The wisdom that a good life is made not from escaping death but from the ordinary, cherished textures of living itself. Good food shared with people we love, rest after honest labor, and something lasting built or created that outlives us. Gilgamesh, restless king that he was, eventually found his way to something like peace with this truth, and perhaps tonight, so might we, as we let this old story settle quietly in our minds and turn our attention next to the historical successors of Gilgamesh's Uruk, and to the ambitious ruler who would, for the first time in recorded history, unite the many independent cities of Mesopotamia under a single throne. For all the centuries we have explored so far, Mesopotamia had remained politically fragmented, a landscape of proud, independent city-states, sometimes at peace, more often at war with one another, but never united under any single ruling authority. This began to change sometime around the 24th century before the Common Era, with the rise of a figure whose life story, as it has come down to us through later legend, reads almost like a piece of literature in its own right, and whose actual historical achievements reshaped the political map of the ancient Near East for centuries afterward. His name was Sargon, and he would become the founder of what many historians consider the world's first true empire, a state that extended its authority not merely over a single city or a small cluster of neighboring towns, but across an enormous swath of territory encompassing dozens of formerly independent cities and multiple distinct peoples and languages. According to a later legendary account, of the kind Mesopotamian kings often composed to add a certain mythic grandeur to their own biographies, Sargon was born of humble and somewhat mysterious origins, the son of a priestess who, unable to raise him openly, placed the infant in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch and set him adrift on the Euphrates River, where he was eventually discovered and raised by a humble gardener, before rising, through talent and the favor of the goddess Ishtar to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, and eventually to seize royal power for himself. Readers familiar with certain other ancient narratives involving infants set adrift on rivers in baskets may notice an intriguing resemblance here, and indeed this basic story pattern, an abandoned or hidden infant of obscure birth who rises to greatness, appears in various forms across many different ancient cultures, which suggests we should probably treat the details of Sargon's supposed early life as legend rather than strict historical fact, even while the broader outline of his rise from a relatively modest position to supreme power appears to reflect something genuinely unusual and noteworthy about his career, remarkable enough that later generations felt compelled to explain it through a suitably dramatic origin story. What we can say with greater historical confidence is that Sargon, having established himself as king, founded a new capital city called Akkad, whose precise location remains, remarkably, still unidentified by modern archaeologists despite considerable searching, somewhere in the vicinity of the Euphrates not far from the older city of Kish. From this new base, Sargon embarked on a series of military campaigns that brought, one after another, the great cities of Sumer under his direct control. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, and eventually cities stretching well beyond the traditional boundaries of Sumer itself, north along the Euphrates and Tigris, and according to inscriptions that survive from his reign, as far west as the Mediterranean coast and as far into the mountains of what is now Iran as any Mesopotamian ruler had yet campaigned. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembered Sargon's conquests with a mixture of awe and pride, and copies of inscriptions describing his campaigns continued to be studied and recopied by scribes for well over 1,000 years after his death, suggesting that his reign genuinely marked a turning point that subsequent generations recognized as historically significant even at the time. The empire Sargon built was held together through a combination of military garrisons stationed in conquered cities, the appointment of loyal officials, sometimes including members of his own family, to govern distant provinces, and a certain degree of administrative standardization, including efforts to promote the Akkadian language, a Semitic language quite different in its underlying structure from Sumerian, though written using the same cuneiform script, as a language of administration, alongside Sumerian itself. This linguistic shift is worth pausing on for a moment, because it reflects a broader and genuinely important pattern in Mesopotamian history. The region was never populated by a single ethnic or linguistic group throughout its long history, but rather by a shifting mixture of peoples, Sumerian speakers in the Deep South in the earliest periods, Akkadian speakers, who were probably present in Mesopotamia for a very long time before Sargon's rise, gradually becoming more prominent both demographically and politically, and later still, other peoples and languages entering the story as new powers rose to prominence. Sargon's reign marks one of the clearest and earliest moments when this Akkadian-speaking population moved decisively into the political foreground, even as Sumerian culture, religion, and writing continued to be studied, respected, and preserved by Akkadian-speaking scribes for many centuries afterward, in something like the reverent way a later civilization might preserve and study the literature of a venerable and admired predecessor. One of the most historically significant figures to emerge from Sargon's own family was his daughter, Enheduanna, whom we briefly mentioned in an earlier chapter. Appointed by her father to the powerful and prestigious position of High Priestess of the moon god Nanna at the city of Ur, a position that also served the practical political purpose of cementing Akkadian control over one of Sumer's most important religious centers, Enheduanna composed a body of hymns and poetry that survive, in copies made by later scribes, to this day. Her compositions include deeply personal reflections on her own experiences, including a poem describing her temporary exile from her priestly position during a period of political upheaval and her eventual tearful restoration to office, making her not only among the earliest named authors in world history but also, in a sense, among the very earliest individuals of any kind, from any culture, whose personal inner voice and specific life experiences have survived in their own words across the vast gulf of more than 4,000 years. Sargon's empire, like most of the great political constructions we will encounter throughout tonight's story, did not last forever in its original form. Later inscriptions and literary traditions describe rebellions against Sargon's authority even during his own long reign, which according to some traditions lasted some 56 years, and further upheavals under his immediate successors. His grandson, Naram-Sin, who ruled perhaps a century after Sargon's original rise to power, is remembered as one of the most powerful rulers of the entire dynasty, credited with further military conquests and famous today for a striking carved monument, the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, which depicts the king in a notably larger scale than the other figures around him, climbing triumphantly up a mountainside over the bodies of his defeated enemies, wearing for the first time in Mesopotamian royal art the horned crown previously reserved exclusively for depictions of the gods themselves, a visual statement of just how far Naram-Sin was willing to elevate his own royal status, declaring himself, according to some inscriptions, to be a god in his own right during his lifetime, a claim not made so explicitly by many other Mesopotamian rulers before or after him. Yet not long after Naram-Sin's reign, the Akkadian Empire entered a period of decline and eventual collapse, a collapse that later Mesopotamian literary tradition, in a text known as the Curse of Akkad, attributed to divine punishment for Naram-Sin's excessive pride, including an alleged act of sacrilege against the great temple of Enlil at Nippur. Modern historians, while treating this literary explanation with appropriate caution, have proposed additional and probably more decisive factors behind the empire's collapse, including invasions by peoples from the surrounding mountains, particularly a group called the Gutians, internal rebellions among the very Sumerian and Akkadian cities Sargon and his successors had originally conquered, and possibly, according to some environmental and archaeological evidence that has emerged in more recent decades, a period of significant climate change and drought across the wider region, which would have placed enormous strain on an agricultural society already dependent on carefully managed irrigation even in the best of times. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the Empire of Akkad had effectively dissolved within roughly a century and a half of its founding, its great capital city eventually abandoned so thoroughly that, as we noted earlier, its exact location remains unknown even today, a genuinely strange and somewhat haunting fact given how significant a place it once was in the political history of the ancient world. Out of this period of fragmentation and disorder, however, a new center of power would eventually emerge in the ancient city of Ur, ushering in a period sometimes described as a Sumerian Renaissance, a final, brilliant flowering of Sumerian political and cultural life before that ancient language and its native speakers gradually receded into the more purely religious and scholarly role we described a moment ago. It is to this period and to the dynasty that ruled it that we turn next. In the wake of the Akkadian Empire's collapse and the disruptive period of Gutian incursion that followed it, a new dynasty arose in the ancient city of Ur, one of the oldest and most venerable of all Sumerian cities, home, as we noted earlier, to the great temple of the moon god Nana. This dynasty, which modern historians label the Third Dynasty of Ur to distinguish it from two earlier, less well-documented ruling houses of the same city, was founded by a king named Ur-Nammu sometime around the 21st century before the Common Era, and it would go on to build what many historians describe as the most tightly organized, most thoroughly documented, and in some respects most bureaucratically sophisticated state that the ancient Near East had yet produced, a genuinely impressive achievement of large-scale administration that, thanks to the survival of tens of thousands of administrative clay tablets from this period, we understand today in far greater granular detail than almost any other era of early Mesopotamian history. Ur-Nammu himself is remembered today for two particularly significant achievements. First, he oversaw the construction, or in some cases the reconstruction and enlargement, of a series of great ziggurats across the cities under his control, including the great ziggurat of Ur itself, whose lower stages, remarkably, still stand today in southern Iraq, having been partially restored and reconstructed by archaeologists and, more recently, by Iraqi authorities, remaining, along with a small number of other Mesopotamian monuments, among the very few structures from this deep antiquity still visible above ground rather than buried beneath the accumulated soil of 40 or more centuries. Second, and of considerable interest to legal historians, Ur-Nammu is credited with issuing what appears to be the oldest surviving law code in the world, predating the far more famous code of Hammurabi, which we will meet in the next chapter, by more than 2 centuries. Only fragments of Ur-Nammu's code survive, inscribed on a small number of recovered tablets, but what remains reveals a legal system already concerned with matters that would remain central to Mesopotamian law for the next 1,500 years. Compensation for physical injuries, penalties for various forms of theft and property damage, regulations concerning marriage, and protections, at least on paper, for socially vulnerable groups such as widows and orphans. The empire built by Ur-Nammu and expanded by his successors, particularly his son Shulgi, who ruled for an impressively long reign of some 48 years according to surviving records, extended its authority over the great majority of the old Sumerian and Akkadian heartland, and maintained this authority through an administrative system of quite extraordinary thoroughness. Provincial governors, appointed by the crown, oversaw local administration in cities throughout the realm, sending regular reports and tribute to the central government. A standardized system of weights, measures, and even a formal state calendar was imposed across the territory, facilitating trade and administration alike. Vast quantities of goods, agricultural produce, textiles, metal goods, and livestock flowed into central collection points, most notably a location called Puzrishdagon near the capital, where scribes recorded, with almost obsessive precision, the arrival and eventual disposition of enormous herds of livestock destined for temple sacrifice, royal consumption, or further redistribution, generating in the process one of the largest bodies of ancient administrative documentation to survive from anywhere in the pre-modern world. Shulgi himself, beyond his lengthy and administratively accomplished reign, cultivated an image of extraordinary personal capability that borders, in surviving royal hymns composed in his honor, on the frankly superhuman. He is praised in these hymns as a warrior without equal, a wise judge, a skilled musician proficient in multiple instruments, a gifted scribe who had personally mastered the scribal arts despite being born a prince rather than a professional scribe's son, and even, in one particularly memorable hymn, as a runner capable of traveling an extraordinary distance between two distant cities and back again within a single day in order to participate personally in religious festivals in both locations. Weathering, the hymn tells us, a fierce storm along the way without ever slowing his pace. Whatever the literal truth of these claims, which were composed, after all, specifically to celebrate and elevate the king's reputation rather than to serve as neutral historical reportage, they reveal a great deal about the qualities Mesopotamian society of this period most admired and wished to see embodied in its ideal ruler. Physical prowess, intellectual accomplishment, religious devotion, and administrative competence, all combined in a single exceptional figure. This period also produced some of the most beautiful and technically accomplished works of Mesopotamian art and craftsmanship to survive from antiquity. Royal tombs from the early dynastic period at Ur, excavated in the 1920s by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in one of the most famous archaeological projects of the early 20th century, revealed astonishingly rich grave goods, golden headdresses, ornately decorated harps inlaid with gold and lapis lazuli, a rich blue semi-precious stone that had to be imported across enormous distances from mines in what is now Afghanistan, and elaborate jewelry of gold, silver, and precious stones, testifying to both the technical skill of Sumerian craftspeople and the very long-distance trade networks that brought exotic raw materials into Mesopotamia from remarkably distant corners of the ancient world. These same tombs also revealed a considerably darker aspect of royal burial practice in this era, since they included the remains of numerous attendants, guards, and musicians, apparently sacrificed to accompany their royal master or mistress into the afterlife, a practice that, while genuinely troubling to consider by modern standards, was apparently not unique to Mesopotamia and appears, in various forms, across a number of other early complex societies around the ancient world. Despite the impressive administrative sophistication of the Ur3 state, it too, like the Akkadian Empire before it, eventually succumbed to a combination of internal and external pressures. Later kings of the dynasty faced growing incursions from neighboring peoples, including the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people originating from the region of Syria who had been gradually migrating into Mesopotamia for some time, and the Elamites, a rival power based in a region of what is now southwestern Iran, with whom Mesopotamian states had a long and complicated history of both trade and warfare stretching back many centuries. In the final years of the dynasty, the last king of Ur, a ruler named Ibisin, appears from surviving correspondence to have watched, with what must have been considerable dismay, as province after province slipped from his control, his authority eventually shrinking to little more than the city of Ur itself, before the city was finally sacked by Elamite forces sometime around the 21st or 20th century before the Common Era, an event of such lasting cultural significance that it inspired a genre of Sumerian literature known as city laments, mournful poems composed to commemorate the destruction of great cities, describing in vivid and genuinely moving language the abandonment of temples, the scattering of populations, and the silence that fell over streets and courtyards that had once been filled with the sounds of daily urban life. With the fall of Ur, the political center of gravity in Mesopotamia would shift definitively away from the old Sumerian heartland in the deep south, and toward a smaller, less historically prominent city further up the Euphrates, a city that had existed for many centuries already but had never before played a particularly significant political role in the wider region. That city was Babylon, and it is to its remarkable rise, under one of the most famous rulers in all of ancient history, that we will now turn. In the centuries following the fall of Ur, Mesopotamia entered a period historians often call the Old Babylonian period, characterized once again by political fragmentation, a landscape of competing city-states, many of them now ruled by dynasties of Amorite origin, the same Semitic-speaking migrant population we mentioned briefly at the close of the last chapter, who had by this point settled thoroughly into Mesopotamian society, adopted its cuneiform writing system and much of its religious tradition, and begun founding their own local ruling dynasties in various cities throughout the region. Among these many competing city-states, one, a relatively modest settlement on the Euphrates called Babylon, would rise, over the course of roughly 2 centuries, from a position of minor regional significance to become the dominant power in all of southern Mesopotamia, and eventually one of the most famous cities in the entire ancient world, a reputation it would carry, in one form or another, for the remainder of Mesopotamian history and well beyond it. Babylon's rise to prominence is most closely associated with a king named Hammurabi, who came to the throne of this still relatively minor city sometime around the 18th century before the Common Era, and who would rule for a reign of some 42 years, during which he transformed Babylon from one power among several roughly equal rivals into the unquestioned master of the entire southern Mesopotamian plain. Hammurabi's early reign appears to have been spent largely on internal consolidation, building projects, and canal maintenance within his existing territory, along with careful, patient diplomacy, forming and dissolving alliances with neighboring rulers as circumstances required. It was only in the latter half of his reign that Hammurabi turned decisively toward military conquest, defeating, in a rapid and remarkably successful series of campaigns spanning roughly the final decade or so of his rule, a succession of rival powers, including the once powerful city of Larsa to the south, and eventually extending Babylonian authority northward as well, bringing the great majority of Mesopotamia under a single ruling authority for the first time since the days of the Ur dynasty several centuries earlier. Hammurabi is remembered today, above nearly everything else about his long and eventful reign, for a single remarkable monument, a tall stone stele, carved from polished black diorite, inscribed with a lengthy collection of laws, prologue, and epilogue, discovered by French archaeologists in the early 20th century at the site of Susa in what is now Iran, where it had apparently been carried off as war booty by an Elamite king many centuries after Hammurabi's own death, a fact that, incidentally, is itself a small but telling illustration of just how long a shadow this particular monument cast across the ancient world, remaining significant and worth stealing as a trophy of conquest well over 1,000 years after it was first carved. The stele, which today stands in the Louvre Museum in Paris, depicts at its top a carved relief showing Hammurabi standing respectfully before the seated sun god Shamash, traditionally associated with justice, who appears to be handing the king a ring and staff symbolizing the authority to rule and to judge, an image intended to convey, quite explicitly, that the laws which follow beneath this carved scene derive their ultimate authority not from Hammurabi's own human will alone but from divine sanction. The code itself, comprising some 280 or so individual laws, though scholars debate the exact original number since some sections of the stele have been damaged or deliberately erased, covers an extraordinary range of everyday and not so everyday human concerns. Regulations governing commercial transactions, contracts, and the responsibilities of merchants. Laws concerning marriage, divorce, inheritance, and the rights and obligations of family members toward one another. Provisions addressing agricultural disputes, the maintenance of irrigation canals, and the liability of a farmer whose negligence in canal maintenance caused flooding damage to a neighbor's field, and a substantial body of what we might call criminal law, addressing theft, assault, and other offenses, often prescribing punishments according to a principle of proportional retaliation captured in the famous phrase an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, though it is worth noting, since this detail is often overlooked in popular summaries of the code, that the actual punishments prescribed varied considerably according to the social status of both the offender and the victim, with harsher penalties generally applying when the victim was of higher social rank than the perpetrator, and correspondingly lighter penalties, often simple monetary compensation rather than physical punishment, applying in cases involving individuals of lower social status. It is worth pausing here to offer a note of appropriate historical caution regarding exactly how this code actually functioned in practice, since this is a point modern scholars have debated at some length. Although the stele presents itself, in its prologue and epilogue, as a comprehensive statement of Hammurabi's justice, intended, in the king's own words, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, the actual surviving legal documents from old Babylonian courts, ordinary contracts, court records, and legal disputes that have survived on clay tablets from the same general period. Only rarely cite the code directly or quote its specific provisions when settling actual legal disputes. This has led many historians to suggest that the code functioned less as a strict, comprehensively enforced statute book in the modern legal sense, and more as a kind of royal monument to justice itself, a public demonstration, prominently displayed where it could be seen and consulted, of the king's wisdom, piety, and fitness to rule, reflecting general legal principles and customary practice of the period, even if individual judges retained considerable discretion in how disputes were actually resolved in daily practice. Whatever its precise practical function, the code remains an extraordinary historical document, offering us one of our richest and most detailed windows into the values, concerns, and everyday texture of life in old Babylonian society, nearly 4,000 years removed from our own. Beyond his famous legal monument, Hammurabi also left behind a substantial body of personal correspondence, preserved in the royal archives of cities under his control, that reveals a ruler deeply, almost obsessively, engaged in the granular daily business of governing his growing kingdom. Surviving letters show Hammurabi personally attending to matters as significant as military strategy and diplomatic relations with neighboring rulers, and as seemingly minor as individual disputes over property boundaries, the proper administration of specific temple offerings, and the correction of what he apparently regarded as errors or inefficiencies on the part of local officials. This pattern of hands-on, detail-oriented royal administration, a king genuinely reading and responding to a very wide range of everyday administrative correspondence rather than delegating such matters entirely to subordinates, suggests a ruler whose success rested not merely on military conquest but on a sustained, patient, and evidently quite personally demanding commitment to the actual daily work of governance. Following Hammurabi's death, the empire he had so carefully assembled began, in a pattern that will by now feel rather familiar from earlier chapters of tonight's story, to gradually contract under the pressure of his less capable successors, external invasions, and internal difficulties, though the city of Babylon itself, having once achieved this position of preeminent regional importance, would never entirely lose its symbolic and cultural significance, even during the centuries when its actual political power waxed and waned considerably. It is to those following centuries, a period sometimes overlooked in popular retellings of Mesopotamian history but nonetheless significant in its own right, and eventually to the northern power that would come to overshadow Babylon for several hundred years, that we now turn our attention. History, as it is generally told and retold, tends to favor moments of dramatic upheaval, the rise and fall of great empires, famous kings and famous battles, over the longer, quieter stretches of time in between, when life for most ordinary people continued along much as it always had, planting and harvesting, raising families, worshipping familiar gods in familiar temples, largely unaffected by the political dramas unfolding in distant royal courts. It is worth pausing in the middle portion of tonight's long journey to acknowledge that such quieter centuries make up the great majority of Mesopotamian history, even if they receive comparatively less attention in most historical accounts, including, admittedly, in this one, simply because they generated fewer of the dramatic, well-documented events that tend to survive clearly in the historical record. In the several centuries following Hammurabi's death, sometime around 1600 years before the Common Era, Babylon itself was eventually overrun by a raid from a distant Hittite kingdom based far to the northwest in what is now central Turkey, a raid that, curiously, does not appear to have been followed by any sustained Hittite occupation of the city, but which nonetheless opened the way for a new ruling dynasty, the Kassites, a people of somewhat mysterious origin whose own language remains poorly understood by modern scholars, to establish themselves as rulers of Babylon and the surrounding region for a period of well over 400 years, one of the longest single dynastic reigns in the entirety of Mesopotamian history. The Kassite period, though comparatively less dramatic and less thoroughly documented than either the preceding Old Babylonian period or the periods that would follow it, was nonetheless a time of considerable cultural continuity and, in many respects, quiet prosperity, during which Babylonian religion, literature, and scholarship continued to develop, with Babylon itself retaining and even enhancing its reputation as a preeminent center of learning, scribal education, and religious prestige throughout the wider Near Eastern world, a reputation that persisted even during the centuries when Babylon's actual political and military power remained comparatively modest. Meanwhile, in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, along the upper Tigris River, A different regional power had been slowly developing across many of these same centuries, centered initially on the city of Ashur, which gave its name to the people, the language, and eventually the empire that would come to be known as Assyria. Ashur had existed as a significant trading city since at least the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, its merchants establishing and maintaining an extensive network of trading colonies stretching hundreds of miles into central Anatolia, where Assyrian traders exchanged textiles and tin, a metal essential for producing bronze, for locally mined silver and gold, in a commercial network we understand today in unusually rich detail thanks to the survival of many thousands of private business letters and contracts recovered from one particular Anatolian trading colony called Kanesh. For much of this early period, however, Ashur remained primarily a commercial center rather than a major military or political power, often existing under the shadow, or even the direct political control, of larger neighboring states. This situation began to change gradually over the course of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, as a series of Assyrian kings expanded their territory and influence, sometimes achieving considerable regional prominence before contracting again under pressure from rival powers, in a recurring pattern of expansion and contraction that would characterize Assyrian history for several centuries before the truly dramatic imperial expansion of the later Assyrian period, which we will explore properly in our next chapter. One notable early figure in this longer arc was a king named Tukulti-Ninurta I, who ruled in the 13th century before the Common Era and who, according to surviving inscriptions, achieved a significant military victory over Babylon itself, temporarily bringing that venerable and prestigious city under direct Assyrian control, a foreshadowing, in many respects, of the far more extensive and sustained Assyrian dominance over Babylon that would characterize later centuries of Mesopotamian history. The broader Near Eastern world of this general period, roughly the 14th through 12th centuries before the Common Era, was home to a genuinely interesting network of major powers who maintained diplomatic relations with one another through an extensive exchange of letters, a body of correspondence preserved for us today primarily through a remarkable archive discovered at the Egyptian site of Amarna, in which the pharaohs of Egypt exchanged letters, gifts, and marriage proposals with the kings of Babylon, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the kingdom of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, and various smaller rulers throughout the Levant, revealing a surprisingly sophisticated and interconnected system of international diplomacy conducted, notably, largely in the Akkadian language and cuneiform script, which had by this period become something like the diplomatic lingua franca of the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, used even by Egyptian scribes who were native speakers of an entirely unrelated language, simply because it had become the established convention for conducting international correspondence across this whole broad region. This relatively stable, interconnected international system, sometimes referred to by modern historians as a kind of ancient international community, came to a rather abrupt and still not fully understood end sometime around 1100 years before the Common Era, in a period of widespread upheaval that affected not only Mesopotamia but the wider Eastern Mediterranean world as well, including the collapse of the Hittite Empire, significant disruption to Egyptian power, and the destruction of numerous cities across the Levant and Anatolia, an episode modern historians often call the Late Bronze Age collapse. The precise causes of this widespread crisis remain a subject of genuine scholarly debate, with historians pointing to various possible contributing factors, including climate change and prolonged drought, waves of migration and invasion by groups referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, internal political and economic strains within the affected states, and disruptions to the long-distance trade networks, particularly in the tin and copper needed to produce bronze, upon which the economies and militaries of this era heavily depended. Mesopotamia itself, somewhat further removed from the Mediterranean coast than Egypt, the Hittites, or the various Levantine kingdoms, weathered this crisis somewhat less catastrophically than its western neighbors, though it too experienced a period of reduced international contact and internal difficulty during these turbulent centuries. It was out of the recovery from this widespread period of crisis and disruption that Assyria would eventually emerge, over the following few centuries, as the single most powerful and, frankly, the single most feared military power the ancient Near East had yet produced, building an empire that would eventually stretch, at its greatest extent, from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt itself. It is to this remarkable, formidable, and in many ways genuinely unsettling empire that we will now turn our attention. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, as historians call the final and by far the most extensive and powerful phase of Assyrian history, developed over the course of several centuries following the disruptions of the late Bronze Age collapse we discussed at the close of the previous chapter, reaching its greatest extent and its most formidable military and administrative sophistication between roughly the 9th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. It is worth being honest in describing this period of Mesopotamian history that Assyria's reputation, both among many of the peoples it conquered in antiquity and among many modern readers encountering its history for the first time, is one of the ancient world's more genuinely fearsome military powers, a state that built its empire through a combination of highly effective, professionalized military organization, systematic use of terror as a deliberate instrument of political control, and, in its later centuries, a genuinely impressive, if often harshly administered, system of imperial governance. Assyrian kings of this period, whose royal inscriptions survive in considerable and often quite vivid detail, describe their military campaigns with a candor about violence that can feel startling to modern readers accustomed to more euphemistic official language. These inscriptions recount, in considerable and evidently deliberately intimidating detail, the destruction of cities that resisted Assyrian authority, the impaling and flaying of captured enemy leaders, and the deportation of entire conquered populations, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands of individuals, forcibly relocated from their homelands to other parts of the empire, a policy intended, quite explicitly, to break the cohesion and rebellious potential of conquered peoples by physically separating them from their traditional homelands, local leadership, and cultural context, while simultaneously providing needed labor and population for other regions of the empire, including, on occasion, the resettlement of loyal populations into newly conquered and depopulated territories. This policy of mass deportation, while genuinely brutal in its human cost, which we should not minimize or gloss over even within the calm, unhurried tone of tonight's larger story, was also, from a purely administrative perspective, remarkably effective at consolidating and stabilizing Assyrian control over an empire of quite extraordinary size and ethnic diversity. Several individual Assyrian kings stand out with particular clarity in the historical record of this period. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled in the 9th century before the Common Era, undertook extensive military campaigns to reassert and expand Assyrian control over neighboring territories, and constructed a magnificent new royal capital at Kalhu, a city known in the Bible and in some later sources as Kala, whose palace walls were decorated with extensive carved stone reliefs depicting the king's military triumphs, religious rituals, and hunting expeditions, reliefs that survive today in remarkable quantity and quality, having been recovered by 19th-century archaeologists and now displayed prominently in major museums around the world, including the British Museum in London, offering us an unusually vivid and detailed visual record of Assyrian royal ideology and daily court life. Tiglath-Pileser III, ruling in the 8th century before the Common Era, undertook significant administrative and military reforms, reorganizing conquered territories into more directly controlled provinces rather than merely nominally subordinate vassal states, and further developing the systematic deportation policies mentioned a moment ago, expanding Assyrian power to its greatest extent yet across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and portions of Iran. Sargon II, ruling in the late 8th century before the Common Era, and taking his throne name in evident deliberate homage to the earlier Sargon of Akkad whom we met several chapters ago, continued this pattern of aggressive military expansion, and built yet another magnificent new royal capital, this one called Dur-Sharrukin, meaning literally fortress of Sargon, though this particular capital, somewhat unusually, appears to have been largely abandoned by his successors shortly after his own death, with the royal court relocating instead to the ancient city of Nineveh, which would become, under Sargon's son and successor Sennacherib, the final and most magnificent capital of the entire Assyrian Empire. Sennacherib expanded and beautified Nineveh on an extraordinary scale, constructing what he himself described, in inscriptions that survive today, as a palace without rival, along with elaborate parks, gardens, and an impressive system of aqueducts and canals bringing fresh water into the city from distant mountain sources. Engineering achievements that some modern scholars have suggested may be at least partly responsible for the later, somewhat confused classical traditions describing legendary hanging gardens in Mesopotamia, traditions we will examine more carefully in a subsequent chapter when we turn our attention to the Neo-Babylonian period. Sennacherib is also remembered, rather less happily, for a brutal campaign against the rebellious city of Babylon itself in the year 689 before the Common Era, during which, according to Assyrian records, the ancient and religiously venerated city was thoroughly sacked and its great temples deliberately damaged or destroyed, an act of destruction against a city widely regarded throughout Mesopotamia as one of the most sacred and prestigious in the entire region, which appears to have shocked and disturbed even some segments of Assyrian society itself, and which Sennacherib's own son and successor, Esarhaddon, felt compelled to reverse, undertaking an extensive and expensive program to rebuild and restore Babylon's damaged temples, an act of religious and political repair that suggests even the mighty Assyrian state recognized certain limits to how far a conqueror could go in disregarding the deep, long-standing religious and cultural prestige of Mesopotamia's most ancient and sacred sites. Beyond its formidable and often brutal military reputation, Assyria under its later kings developed a genuinely sophisticated system of imperial administration, including an extensive network of roads maintained specifically to allow royal messengers and administrative communications to travel quickly across the vast expanse of the empire, something like an ancient precursor to later, more famous imperial postal and road systems developed by other empires in subsequent centuries. Assyrian kings also maintained large and increasingly professionalized standing armies, incorporating advanced siege warfare techniques, including massive wheeled siege towers and battering rams depicted in considerable detail in the palace reliefs mentioned earlier, technology and tactics that allowed Assyrian forces to besiege and eventually capture even the most heavily fortified cities of the ancient Near East, a military capability that few, if any, of their neighbors and rivals could reliably match during this period of Assyrian dominance. It is to the final and in some ways most intellectually remarkable chapter of Assyrian history, the reign of a king who combined the same formidable military tradition with a genuinely extraordinary personal passion for scholarship and the written word, that we turn next. Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Assyrian Empire during the middle portion of the 7th century before the Common Era, presents us with one of the more genuinely fascinating figures in the entire long story we have been telling tonight, a king who continued the aggressive military traditions of his Assyrian predecessors, leading campaigns against Egypt, against the rival kingdom of Elam, and against various rebellious territories within his own vast empire, while simultaneously pursuing, with what appears from surviving evidence to have been genuine personal enthusiasm rather than merely conventional royal piety, one of the most ambitious scholarly and literary projects of the entire ancient world. The assembly, at his capital of Nineveh, of an enormous library containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, gathered systematically from across the breadth of Mesopotamia and covering an extraordinary range of subjects. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions describe his education in terms that suggest he received training in scribal skills unusually extensive for a member of the royal family, most of whom, in earlier periods, would have left the detailed technical work of reading and writing cuneiform to professional scribes rather than mastering it personally to any great depth. Ashurbanipal claims, in these inscriptions, to have studied not only the practical scribal skills of reading and writing but also more specialized and difficult scholarly disciplines, including the interpretation of omens, mathematics, and the study of older Sumerian and Akkadian literary and religious texts, some of which were, by his own time, already well over 1,000 years old and required specialized training simply to read accurately, since the Sumerian language itself had by this point ceased to be spoken as anyone's native tongue for well over a millennium, surviving only as a learned, scholarly language, rather like Latin in much later European history, studied and preserved by educated scribes even though no one any longer spoke it in ordinary daily conversation. Motivated by this evident personal scholarly interest, Ashurbanipal dispatched agents across his empire, and evidently to Babylon and other ancient Sumerian and Babylonian cities in particular, with instructions to seek out, copy, or in some cases apparently simply confiscate, tablets containing important literary, religious, medical, mathematical, and divinatory texts, and to bring them back to Nineveh for inclusion in his growing royal library. Surviving correspondence and administrative records from this project reveal a king personally and quite specifically engaged in this collection effort, in some cases writing directly to instruct his agents on exactly which texts to seek out and how thoroughly and accurately they should be copied, revealing a level of personal royal investment in what we might today call cultural and archival preservation that is genuinely unusual, as far as the surviving record allows us to judge, among the rulers of the ancient world. The resulting library, discovered by British archaeologists excavating the ruins of Nineveh in the middle of the 19th century, proved to be one of the single most important archaeological discoveries in the entire history of ancient Near Eastern studies, providing modern scholars with the largest and most complete collection of Mesopotamian literary, religious, and scientific texts recovered from any single site anywhere in the ancient world. It was among the tablets of this very library, in fact, that the most complete surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story we explored together several chapters ago, was eventually discovered and pieced back together, along with numerous other important literary works, extensive collections of omens and divinatory texts used by Mesopotamian scholars to interpret everything from the flight patterns of birds to the appearance of a sacrificed animal's liver as signs of future events, medical texts cataloging diagnoses and treatments for a wide range of ailments, and detailed astronomical records, since Mesopotamian scholars had, over many centuries, developed a genuinely sophisticated tradition of careful, systematic astronomical observation, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets with an accuracy and consistency that would eventually influence, through channels of transmission across many subsequent centuries and cultures, the later astronomical traditions of the Greek world and beyond. It is worth pausing to reflect for a moment on the particular strangeness and the particular fortune of how this remarkable library has come down to us. Ashurbanipal's own empire, as we will see in the next portion of tonight's story, would collapse with startling speed within just a couple of decades of his death, and the great city of Nineveh itself would be violently destroyed, its palaces burned, in a conquest we will describe shortly. And yet it was precisely this catastrophic destruction, this violent burning of Ashurbanipal's palace, that inadvertently preserved his library for us today, since the intense heat of the fire that consumed the palace baked and hardened the clay tablets stored within it, transforming what might otherwise have remained soft, vulnerable, unfired clay into something considerably more durable, before the ruins were buried beneath collapsed mud brick walls and, over the following 25 centuries, beneath the slowly accumulating soil of the Mesopotamian plain, waiting patiently in the darkness until 19th century archaeologists finally uncovered them and began the long, painstaking work of reading, translating, and piecing back together a body of ancient literature and scholarship that would otherwise have been almost entirely lost to the modern world. Ashurbanipal's reign, for all its military and scholarly accomplishments, marked, as it happened, very nearly the final high point of Assyrian imperial power. Following his death, sometime around 627 years before the Common Era, the vast Assyrian Empire, weakened by succession disputes among Ashurbanipal's own sons and by the sheer long-term strain of maintaining military and administrative control over such an enormous and ethnically diverse territory, began to fracture with remarkable speed. A resurgent Babylon, under a new king named Nabopolassar, rose in rebellion against Assyrian authority and formed a powerful alliance with the Medes, an emerging power based in the mountains of what is now western Iran, and together these allied forces waged a series of campaigns that brought the once seemingly invincible Assyrian Empire to a shockingly abrupt and total end. The great Assyrian capital of Nineveh itself fell to this combined Babylonian and Median assault in the year 612 before the Common Era, sacked and burned so thoroughly, in the very fire that ironically preserved Ashurbanipal's library for future generations, that the city was essentially abandoned afterward, never again to serve as a major center of political power, its very location eventually fading from confident historical memory for well over 2,000 years, until it too was rediscovered by 19th century archaeologists working, in a certain poetic sense, to excavate and restore to memory a civilization that had once dominated the entire ancient Near East and then, within the span of just a few decades, effectively vanished from history's active stage. It was out of the ashes of this stunningly rapid Assyrian collapse that Babylon itself would rise once more, for a final, brilliant, and in many respects genuinely magnificent chapter of its own long history, under a dynasty and a particular king whose name remains, even today, one of the most widely recognized from the entire span of ancient Mesopotamian history. It is to this final flowering of Babylonian power that we now, at last, turn. The empire that arose from the destruction of Assyria, sometimes called the Neo-Babylonian Empire or the Chaldean Empire, after the name of the particular tribal and political grouping to which its founding dynasty belonged, would prove to be relatively short-lived by the standards of some of the political structures we have explored earlier in tonight's story, lasting less than a century in total. And yet it would leave behind a legacy so vivid, so thoroughly captured in later literary religious, and historical traditions that Babylon's name from this particular period has remained, arguably, more widely recognized in later Western culture than almost any other single episode from the entire multi-thousand-year span of Mesopotamian civilization we have been exploring together tonight. The empire's true architect of lasting fame was Nebuchadnezzar II, son of the Nabopolassar who had led the successful rebellion against Assyrian authority we described at the close of the previous chapter, and who came to the Babylonian throne himself in the year 605 before the Common Era, ruling for some 43 years afterward. Nebuchadnezzar inherited an empire already freed from Assyrian domination and considerably expanded through his father's military campaigns, and he continued this pattern of vigorous military activity throughout his own long reign, extending Babylonian control over much of the territory the Assyrians had previously dominated, including, significantly, the Kingdom of Judah in the southern Levant, whose capital city of Jerusalem Nebuchadnezzar's forces besieged and eventually, after a rebellion, destroyed in the year 586 before the Common Era, an event that resulted in the deportation of a substantial portion of Judah's population to Babylon itself, an episode remembered in later Jewish, and subsequently Christian, religious tradition as the Babylonian exile, and one that has left Babylon's name carrying a particular symbolic weight in Western religious and literary tradition ever since, associated, in this particular strand of cultural memory, with conquest, displacement, and the longing of an exiled people for their distant homeland. Beyond his military campaigns, though, Nebuchadnezzar is remembered above nearly everything else for the truly extraordinary building program he undertook within Babylon itself, transforming the city, according to both the archaeological evidence recovered by modern excavators and the admiring accounts of later Greek visitors and historians who saw the city, or at least its ruins, in subsequent centuries, into what may genuinely have been the largest, wealthiest, and most architecturally spectacular city anywhere in the world during this particular period of history. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt and massively expanded Babylon's city walls, described by later classical authors in terms so impressively large that some ancient writers frankly struggled to believe the reported dimensions, constructed the famous Ishtar Gate, an enormous ceremonial gateway decorated with rows of glazed brick reliefs depicting striding lions, dragons, and bulls in vivid blue, yellow, and white, a substantial portion of which survives today, having been carefully excavated, removed, and reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where visitors can still stand before its glazed brick facade and gain some genuine sense of the visual splendor that greeted travelers approaching Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon along its great ceremonial processional way. Nebuchadnezzar also thoroughly renovated and enlarged the great ziggurat of Babylon, dedicated to the god Marduk, who had by this period risen to become the supreme deity of the entire Babylonian pantheon, a towering, multi-tiered structure that later classical tradition, and eventually the biblical account preserved in the book of Genesis, would remember, whether accurately reflecting this specific monument or drawing on a somewhat more generalized memory of Mesopotamian temple towers, as the Tower of Babel. And it is in connection with Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon that we encounter perhaps the single most famous and most historically puzzling monument associated with this entire period. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, traditionally counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, described by various later Greek and Roman authors as an extraordinary, multi-tiered garden built to resemble a natural mountainside, constructed, according to one popular later tradition, by Nebuchadnezzar for his wife, said to have come from the mountainous region of Media and to have missed the green hills of her distant homeland amid the flat, dusty plain of Babylon. It is worth being genuinely honest, in a story that has tried throughout to remain reasonably careful about distinguishing established historical fact from legend and later embellishment, that the Hanging Gardens present modern historians with a genuinely puzzling and still unresolved historical problem, since despite very extensive archaeological excavation at the site of Babylon itself, no definitive physical or contemporary textual evidence for such a garden, precisely as later classical authors described it, has yet been conclusively identified, and no Babylonian text from Nebuchadnezzar's own reign or from the reigns immediately following it makes any clear reference to such a construction, which is genuinely curious given how thoroughly Nebuchadnezzar otherwise documented and celebrated his many other building achievements in his own inscriptions. Some modern historians have proposed an intriguing alternative explanation, suggesting that later classical writers may have conflated or confused Babylon with the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, where, as we mentioned in the previous chapter, King Sennacherib had indeed constructed extensive and well-documented gardens and sophisticated irrigation and water-lifting systems capable of watering elevated terraces, a theory that remains a genuine subject of scholarly debate rather than settled. Historical fact. Whatever the precise truth behind this particular legend, the story of the Hanging Gardens has become, in its own right, an enduring symbol of Babylon's broader reputation, in both ancient and modern imagination alike, as a city of almost fantastical wealth, luxury, and architectural ambition, a reputation that, garden or no garden, the very real and thoroughly documented splendor of Nebuchadnezzar's actual, historically attested building projects would have amply justified on its own. Babylonian scholarship and intellectual life flourished considerably during this Neo-Babylonian period as well, building on the very long tradition of astronomical observation we touched on in the previous chapter's discussion of Ashurbanipal's library. Babylonian astronomers of this general era and the centuries immediately following it developed remarkably precise mathematical methods for predicting astronomical events, including eclipses and planetary movements, compiling systematic observational records that, in some cases, extended back continuously for well over a century, an achievement of patient, disciplined scientific record-keeping that would later exert genuine and well-documented influence on the astronomical traditions of the ancient Greek world, transmitted through channels of scholarly contact that continued for many centuries after Babylon's own political independence had come to its end. That end, as it happened, arrived only a few decades after Nebuchadnezzar's own long and glorious reign concluded, brought about not through any prolonged military struggle of the kind that had characterized so many earlier transitions of power in Mesopotamian history, but through a comparatively swift and, according to some later traditions, almost bloodless conquest by a rising new power from the east. It is to this final transition, the end of independent Mesopotamian political power and the beginning of a new imperial order that would, in various forms, govern this ancient land for many centuries to come, that we turn in our next and penultimate chapter. Nebuchadnezzar's own successors on the Babylonian throne proved, on the whole, considerably less capable and less long-lived in their rule than the great king himself had been, and the several decades following his death in 562 before the Common Era were marked by a series of relatively short reigns, court intrigues, and at least one violent succession crisis, before the throne eventually passed to a king named Nabonidus, whose own reign presents modern historians with a genuinely curious and still somewhat debated historical puzzle. Nabonidus appears, from surviving inscriptions, to have held a personal religious devotion to the moon god Sin that was unusually intense even by the standards of Mesopotamian royal piety, to the point of favoring Sin's worship, and particularly the god's ancient cult center at the city of Haran in northern Mesopotamia, in ways that some historians believe may have alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk at Babylon itself, the very priesthood whose support had traditionally been essential to any Babylonian king's legitimacy and effective authority. Compounding this apparent religious tension, Nabonidus spent a lengthy and, from the perspective of his capital city, genuinely unusual period of roughly a decade residing not in Babylon at all but at a distant oasis called Tema, deep in the Arabian desert, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear from the surviving evidence, though various inscriptions suggest a combination of religious motivations, commercial interests connected to valuable trade routes passing through the region, and possibly health concerns, leaving the day-to-day governance of Babylon itself in the hands of his son, a prince named Belshazzar, whose name may be familiar to some listeners from a rather dramatic biblical account describing a great feast and an ominous message mysteriously written on a palace wall, a story that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, at least reflects an authentic later cultural memory of Belshazzar as a prominent figure closely associated with Babylon during its final years of independence. Meanwhile, to the east, a new and rapidly rising power had been gathering strength under a remarkable king named Cyrus, who had already united the Persian and Median peoples under his own rule and gone on to conquer, in a series of impressively swift and successful campaigns, the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia and considerable additional territory besides, building what would soon become the largest empire the ancient world had yet witnessed. In the year 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus turned his attention to Babylon itself, and according to Babylonian and later Greek historical accounts, the city fell to Persian forces remarkably quickly and with comparatively little destructive violence, particularly when set against the far more brutal sieges and sackings that had characterized so many earlier conquests throughout the long history we have followed together tonight. Some ancient accounts suggest that Babylonian priests and officials, disaffected by Nabonidus's unusual religious policies and prolonged absence from the city, may have actively welcomed or at least offered little meaningful resistance to Cyrus's advancing forces, opening the way for what one famous surviving inscription, a clay cylinder commissioned by Cyrus himself and known today as the Cyrus cylinder, describes as a peaceful entry into the city, welcomed by its inhabitants, though we should, as always, treat a conqueror's own account of his supposedly welcomed conquest with a reasonable degree of appropriate historical skepticism regarding whose interests such a narrative was designed to serve. The Cyrus cylinder itself deserves a moment of our attention here, since it has achieved, in more recent centuries, a particular and somewhat unusual significance in modern discussions of ancient history, having been interpreted by some as an early expression of principles resembling religious tolerance and even, in some more enthusiastic modern readings, something approaching a declaration of human rights, since the inscription describes Cyrus restoring various displaced peoples and their religious cult statues to their original homes and permitting the reconstruction of temples that had fallen into disrepair or been destroyed under previous rulers, a policy that, in the specific historical case of the Judean population deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, is described in the biblical book of Ezra as extending to permission for the Judean exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Modern historians generally view the Cyrus cylinder with somewhat more measured and contextually grounded interpretation than its most enthusiastic modern popularizers, recognizing it as a fairly conventional example of the kind of self-legitimizing royal inscription that Mesopotamian kings had been producing for many centuries already, presenting a new conqueror as a restorer of proper religious order rather than as a destructive foreign invader, even while acknowledging that Cyrus's actual policies toward conquered peoples and their religious traditions do appear, based on the available evidence, to have been genuinely and notably more accommodating than those pursued by many of his imperial predecessors, including, quite pointedly, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires whose own record of deportation and religious suppression we explored in earlier chapters of tonight's story. With Cyrus's conquest, independent Mesopotamian political rule, in the specific sense of a native Mesopotamian dynasty governing from a Mesopotamian capital according to essentially Mesopotamian political and religious traditions, came to its effective and final end, after a span of political history stretching back, as we trace together across this long night's journey, well over 2,500 years to the earliest cities of Sumer. Babylon itself did not disappear from history at this point, however. It continued to exist as an important provincial capital and major center of trade, scholarship, and religious life within the vast Persian Empire, and would remain significant enough, some 2 centuries later, to serve as the site where the great Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great, having overthrown the Persian Empire in turn, chose to establish one of his own royal residences, and where, according to ancient historical tradition, Alexander himself would eventually die in the year 323 before the Common Era, a curious and rather fitting historical bookend, in its own quiet way, bringing one of the most famous conquerors of the ancient Mediterranean world to breathe his last within the walls of a city whose own political independence had ended less than 2 centuries earlier, in a land whose civilization, by that point, already stretched back further into the past than Alexander's own Greek civilization would eventually stretch forward into the future. Cuneiform writing itself, remarkably, continued to be used for several more centuries after Cyrus's conquest, primarily by a shrinking community of Babylonian priests and scholars who maintained the old astronomical, religious, and scribal traditions largely for their own scholarly and religious purposes, even as the everyday administrative and commercial life of Mesopotamia increasingly shifted toward other, more widely spoken languages and simpler writing systems, most notably Aramaic, written in an alphabetic script that had spread widely across the Near East and was considerably easier to learn than the many hundreds of individual cuneiform signs a fully trained Mesopotamian scribe had traditionally been required to master. The very last known cuneiform tablets, remarkably specialized astronomical texts produced by a dwindling handful of Babylonian temple scholars, date to the 1st century of the Common Era, meaning that cuneiform writing, in an unbroken tradition of gradually evolving use, persisted for very nearly 3,500 years from its earliest tentative beginnings in the temple accounts of ancient Uruk to its final, quiet disappearance from active use, an extraordinarily long lifespan for any writing system in the whole of human history, one that few, if any other scripts, ancient or modern, have yet managed to match or are ever likely to match. And so, with the quiet fading of cuneiform script from active use, and with Mesopotamia settling into its long subsequent history as a province, in turn, of the Persian, Greek, Parthian, and eventually Roman, Sasanian, and finally Islamic worlds, we arrive at the natural closing point of tonight's very long and very old story. Before we let it rest entirely, though, let us spend a final, gentle chapter simply reflecting together on what this remarkable civilization actually left behind for all the centuries and civilizations that followed it, including, in ways you may not have fully realized until this very night, our own. As we come now to the close of tonight's long and unhurried journey through the history of ancient Mesopotamia, it is worth taking a few final, quiet minutes to consider just how much of that ancient civilization, though its cities have long since crumbled into low mounds of dust and its languages have not been spoken in ordinary daily life for well over 2,000 years, continues nonetheless to shape the world we ourselves inhabit today, often in ways so deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary modern life that we rarely pause to notice their extraordinarily ancient origin at all. Consider, to begin with, something as simple and as universally familiar as the way we measure time. The division of an hour into 60 minutes, and a minute into 60 seconds, along with the division of a full circle into 360 degrees, derives from the base 60, or sexagesimal mathematical system developed by Mesopotamian scholars many thousands of years ago, a system that, unlike our own familiar base 10 counting, divides more easily and evenly into many different smaller fractions, a genuinely practical mathematical advantage that Mesopotamian astronomers and mathematicians recognized and exploited many centuries before the Greek scholars who would later inherit and build upon so much of Mesopotamian astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Every single time you glance at a clock or watch or the corner of a phone screen to check how many minutes remain before you might finally allow yourself to drift off to sleep tonight, you are, in a small and largely unnoticed way, using a system of measurement first developed by scribes and scholars working in the temples and observatories of ancient Sumer and Babylon. Consider, too, the profound and lasting influence Mesopotamian literature and mythology exerted on later religious and literary traditions across the wider Near Eastern and Mediterranean world. The flood narrative embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we explored together several chapters ago, shares striking and by now very well documented similarities with the flood story of Noah found in the biblical book of Genesis, similarities that most modern biblical scholars attribute to a shared, very ancient Mesopotamian narrative tradition from which multiple later cultures, including the authors of the Hebrew Bible, ultimately drew, whether through direct literary contact or through a longer, more diffuse process of cultural transmission across the interconnected societies of the ancient Near East. Similarly, the legal traditions embodied in codes like that of Hammurabi, with their concern for proportional justice, their detailed regulation of commercial contracts and family relationships, and their explicit claim to divine sanction for human law, established patterns of legal thinking and legal literature that would echo, in various transformed and adapted ways, through the subsequent legal traditions of the wider ancient Near East, including, many scholars believe, aspects of the legal material preserved within the Hebrew Bible itself. Consider, as well, the more purely intellectual and scientific legacy of Mesopotamian scholarship, the patient centuries of astronomical observation we discussed in connection with both Ashurbanipal's library and the astronomer priests of Neo-Babylonian Babylon, observation and mathematical modeling sophisticated enough that later Greek astronomers, including figures whose names remain far better known today than most of the Mesopotamian scholars whose foundational work they inherited and built upon, drew directly and quite explicitly on Babylonian astronomical data and mathematical methods in developing their own influential models of the heavens, models that would themselves eventually be inherited by medieval Islamic astronomers, and later still by the astronomers of Renaissance and early modern Europe, in a long, largely invisible chain of transmitted knowledge stretching back, ultimately, to patient priests recording the movements of the moon and planets from the rooftops of Babylonian temples many centuries before the Common Era even began. And consider, finally, and perhaps most fundamentally of all, the sheer fact of the city itself, the basic pattern of dense, organized, permanently settled human life, coordinated through shared institutions, written records, and formal law, gathered around centers of religious and administrative authority, connected to its surrounding agricultural hinterland through networks of trade and taxation, which very likely received its first full, mature expression anywhere in the world along the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris, in cities like Uruk and Ur and Eridu, long before similar urban patterns would independently emerge in the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, and the river valleys of China, and long before they would eventually come to characterize the great majority of human settlement patterns across virtually the entire modern world, in which the majority of our own species now lives, for better and for worse, in cities rather than in small rural villages. In this very real and quite direct sense, if you are listening to this story tonight from within any modern city or town, surrounded by neighbors who are not your kin, governed by written laws you did not personally negotiate, purchasing food you did not grow yourself using currency backed by institutions you have never personally visited, you are living, in a meaningful sense, within a pattern of human social organization whose deepest roots reach back to the mud-brick streets of ancient Uruk, 5,000 years and more into the past. It would be easy, faced with the sheer scale and remoteness of this deep history, to feel a certain melancholy at how thoroughly it has vanished, how completely those once thriving cities have dissolved into low, anonymous mounds scattered across the modern Iraqi countryside, how silent the great temples of Marduk and Enlil and Inanna have fallen after so many thousands of years of continuous worship and ritual. And there is, certainly, something genuinely worth pausing over in that melancholy, the same quiet, universal melancholy the Sumerians themselves expressed so movingly in their own laments over the fall of Ur, the same recognition of impermanence that drove Gilgamesh out into the wilderness in grief and fear so many centuries ago. But there is also, if we sit with the story a little longer, something quietly hopeful to be found here as well, because these people and their cities and their gods and their kings and their careful, patient scribes did not simply vanish without a trace, the way it might sometimes feel late at night when we consider the passage of time and the eventual fading of all things. They left behind clay tablets, patiently pressed with wedge-shaped signs, that still speak to us today, in careful modern translation, of love and grief and ambition and administration and law and poetry and the movements of the moon and stars. They left behind walls and ziggurats, however fragmentary, that archaeologists still carefully study and in some cases, still stand beneath. And they left behind, quietly embedded in the very structure of our clocks, our laws, our cities, and our oldest stories, a set of foundations so deep and so thoroughly built upon by every subsequent layer of history that we rarely think to look down and notice them at all. So as you let this long story finally come to rest tonight, and as you allow your own mind to loosen its grip on wakefulness the way a Sumerian farmer might once have let go of his tools at the end of a long day's labor along the riverbank, perhaps you might carry with you, into whatever dreams await you, this last and gentlest thought, that 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, in the hot, dry, flood-prone land between two ancient rivers, ordinary people not so very different from yourself, tired, after their own long days, lay down to sleep beneath very much the same moon and stars you might glimpse tonight if you looked outside your own window, and that in some very quiet and very real sense, the simple, ordinary human act you are about to perform right now, letting the day's cares finally soften and dissolve into rest, connects you to them, and to every other person who has ever closed their eyes at the end of a long day, across every single one of the many thousands of years that separate their world from your own. Sleep well.